The Reconstruction period is one of the most interesting, complicated, extremely frustrating to understand periods in American history. It is also one of the periods that, or the things that have gone on and that went on in Reconstruction, are things that are more or less still with us today if we want to take the long view. And I think you can't understand the modern United States without understanding what happened during Reconstruction, what was attempted during Reconstruction, what failed during Reconstruction, and perhaps most importantly, why it failed, and in many ways, why the country went backwards after Reconstruction's failure. You see here on this title slide on the left a map which shows the Confederate States and also their readmission. If you zoom in closely, you can see the date underneath the state name is their readmission into the Union. And then underneath that, in parentheses, there's the date at which what was then called a conservative government was reestablished in those states. And by conservative government, we mean a government that went back and undid all the attempts at Reconstruction, right? So the establishment of a southern state that had everything except slavery that had existed before. In other words, what I'm trying to say is the establishment of a white supremacy southern state after the various attempts at reform during Reconstruction had failed. In this lecture, I'm going to work through a number of themes that focus on the creation, implementation, and removal of the period of post-Civil War Reconstruction in the United States. Now, this is from 1865 to 1877. There are four major subtopics in this lecture, which together tell the chronological and thematic development of many of the events during the Reconstruction. And these four subtopics are the meaning of freedom, the making of radical Reconstruction in the South, and the overthrow of Reconstruction. Now, when studying both the textbook and listening to this lecture and any other material I give you, it will be helpful to connect each of these larger topics' meanings to construct an understanding of Reconstruction as a whole. Additionally, connecting the people, events, dates, and overall anecdotes, those are historical stories and examples, within each subtopic will also give you a better understanding of each individual stage of Reconstruction. And if I were to have a focus question for this lecture, it would be the meaning of freedom during Reconstruction. What visions of freedom did former slaves and slaveholders pursue in the post-war South? After the war, the destruction of slavery made the definition of freedom central to reconstructing the nation. Whether freedom simply meant abolition of slavery or the expansion of African American rights became a terrain of conflict. African Americans' understanding of freedom was shaped by their experiences of slavery. After the Civil War, African Americans were eager to participate in activities forbidden under the slave system. Black institutions established under slavery, such as the family and secret slave church communities and free black churches and schools, were strengthened and expanded after the war. The family was fundamental to post-war African American life. Former slaves sought to find loved ones separated from them by sale, and widows of black soldiers won the right to gain pensions from the federal government. The federal government acknowledged the status of slave marriages also, and Reconstruction also transformed relationships within families as black men and women sought to inhabit the separate spheres of free families, with women spending more time with families at home and men engaging in most work outside the home. Yet poverty compelled many black women to find wage work. After the war, most blacks were also left white churches and established their own churches. Independent black churches, most notably Methodists and Baptists, grew rapidly, and the church became central to black life. providing an educational, social, and political space for the black community. Freed people, that is, former slaves who were freed by the Civil War, freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, but also, more importantly, the 13th Amendment, actively sought to improve themselves through education, which they hope would allow them to read the Bible, to prosper, and to participate in politics. Also, the first black colleges were founded at this time. Here is a sketch called The Marriage of a Colored Soldier at Vicksburg. A sketch of a wedding ceremony. The sketch is by Alfred Ward soon after the end of the Civil War. The important is here, this is a marriage of a soldier, a Union soldier. And this is an 1890 photograph after Reconstruction by Rudolph Eichmeyer. Right? I think it shows that during Reconstruction and for years thereafter, former slaves exhibited a deep desire for education and learning took place outside of school as well as within. So this is a picture entitled Mother and Daughter Reading. Inevitably, in a society in which political participation was central to freedom, former slaves wanted the right to vote. Once the war ended, and even earlier in some parts of the South, free blacks and former slaves asserted themselves in the public sphere, meeting, petitioning, and demanding the right to vote and organize their own political groups and candidates. Black leaders insisted that anything less than full citizenship would betray the war's meaning. Blacks now celebrated, for instance, the 4th of July, a holiday that many white Southerners soon came to shun. Land ownership was at the core of former slaves' sense of freedom. By acquiring land, the free slaves hoped to create an economic life and communities beyond white control and interference. Some former slaves believed they had earned rights to the land through their unpaid labor. While freed people's ideas of freedom were similar to those of white Americans, including self-ownership, family stability, religious liberty, political participation, and economic independence, they often saw freedom as an open-ended process of transformation, not a birthright that could be assumed. Although the freed people failed to achieve full freedom as they understood it, their definition did much to shape the national debate during the turbulent era of Reconstruction. This is 5 Generations of a Black Family. It's the title of an 1862 photograph that suggests the power of family ties among emancipated slaves. And here is an engraving called The First African Church. This is an engraving in Harper's Weekly, perhaps the most prominent magazine in the United States at the time, and this is June 27th, 1874. The establishment of independent black churches was an enduring accomplishment of Reconstruction. And here are 2 maps of the Barrow Plantation, and they illustrate the effects of emancipation on rural life in the South. In 1860, map on the left, slaves lived in communal quarters near the owner's house. 21 years later, former slaves working as sharecroppers lived scattered across the plantations and had their own churches and schools. Most Southern whites were dismayed by defeat and emancipation, which caused enormous destruction and resulted in Northern domination. Some 260,000 Southern white men died in the war, more than a fifth of the South's adult male whites, and the war destroyed much of the agricultural property on which the Southern economy was based. Plantation-owning families faced enormous changes, having lost their slaves and their life savings, which had been invested in now worthless Confederate government bonds. With their slave labor gone, some had to engage in physical labor for the first time in their lives. Southern planters tried to impose their own vision of freedom on the former slaves, seeking to regain the old control they had exercised under slavery. Freedom for the planters still meant hierarchy and mastery. From their perspective, it was a privilege, not a right, and did not mean economic independence or civil and political equality. Northerners immediately tried to impose their own vision of freedom as free labor. Blacks would become wage workers and landowners, just like the free whites in the North, and Northern investors would inject capital and migrants into the South to rebuild the economy. The South would eventually resemble the free society of the North. Conflict, of course, was inevitable. Planners wanted a labor system as close to slavery as possible, but former slaves wanted economic autonomy and access to the land. It fell to the Freedmen's Bureau, which I'll explain in a minute, to attempt to establish a working free labor system. This is a painting from Winslow Homer, probably the most famous painter, American painter of the 19th century, certainly one of the most, called A Visit from the Old Mistress, and it depicts an imaginary meeting between a Southern white woman and her former slaves. Their stance and gaze suggest the tensions arising from the birth of a new social order. Now, despite the clear class differences suggested by their clothing, at least in terms of stance and height, Homer places his subjects on an equal footing. Yet, of course, he maintains a space of separation between them. He exhibited the painting to acclaim at the Paris Universal Exposition in 1878. And this is a cartoon, again, by artist Winslow Homer, published in, again, Harper's Weekly, July 29, 1865, called The Great Labor Question from a Southern Point of View. Homer satirizes the attitudes of many white Southerners. While blacks labor in the field, an idle planter warns a former slave, "My boy, we've toiled and taken care of you long enough. Now you've got to work." Directed by O. Howard, and that actually is his name, his first two initials are O, who was a Civil War veteran from Maine, the Freedmen's Bureau was an experiment in government social policy, and its responsibilities can only be described as daunting. The Bureau's agents were tasked with establishing schools, giving aid to the poor and aged, solving disputes between whites and blacks, and ensuring equal treatment for former slaves and white unionists in the courts. Though the Bureau, which existed from 1865 to 1870, had no more than 1,000 agents at its height, it accomplished much in education and health care. By 1869, nearly 3,000 schools, serving more than 150,000 pupils in the South, reported to the Bureau. But the Bureau had a conflicted legacy in economic affairs. The Bureau believed that sound race relations in the South would rest on fair wages and working conditions and on opportunities for improvement and social advance. But freed people, former slaves, wanted land, not wage work on plantations. The law founding the Bureau enabled the agency to divide abandoned and confiscated land into 40-acre plots for rental and sale to the freed people. But in the summer of 1865, President Andrew Johnson ordered that almost all confiscated land in federal hands be returned to former owners. In South Carolina and Georgia, Army troops forcibly evicted blacks who had been given land by General Sherman. Although blacks protested, no land distribution occurred, and nearly all rural freed people stayed poor and propertyless during Reconstruction. They had little choice but to return to work on the plantations, often for former owners. Black men were mostly confined to farm work, unskilled labor, and service jobs. Black women were restricted to domestic work as cooks and maids. Wages were too low to build savings or wealth, although by 1900 a significant number of Southern blacks had acquired small parcels of land. But that's 1900. It's 35 years after the end of the Civil War. The failure of land reform produced a deep sense of betrayal. Here is an engraving, again, Harper's Weekly, July 25th, 1868. And again, I'm using Harper's Weekly again and again and again because it's by far the dominant weekly magazine at the time, and is called the Freedmen's Bureau. It depicts a bureau agent as a promoter of racial peace in the violent post-war South. And here's Winslow Homer's 1876 painting, The Cotton Pickers, one of a series of studies of rural life in Virginia. It portrays two black women as dignified figures without a trace of the stereotyping so common in that era's representation of former slaves. The expressions on their faces are ambiguous, perhaps conveying disappointment that 11 years after the end of slavery, they are still at work in the fields. And here we have a photograph, which those were called daguerreotypes back in this period, from around 1865, of a nursemaid and her charge. Lots of black women were employed as nursemaids in white households. This map is really very good. It shows, this is 1880, it shows that sharecropping had become the dominant form of agricultural labor in large parts of the South. Now, this system involved both white and black farmers. Out of the conflict on plantations, new labor systems emerged in the South. The task system survived in the rice areas of South Carolina and Georgia, whereas supervised wage labor predominated on the sugar plantations of Louisiana. Sharecropping became the norm in the Cotton Belt and much of the tobacco areas of Virginia and North Carolina. Sharecropping developed first as a compromise between black desires for land and planters' insistence on labor discipline. It allowed each black family to rent a part of a plantation, and the crop was divided between the worker and the owner at the end of the year. Sharecropping gave planters a stable labor force, and former slaves preferred it to gang labor because it freed them from direct white supervision. But sharecropping became increasingly oppressive over time, especially as declining prices for southern crops limited opportunities for sharecroppers. The war and its aftermath also greatly impacted white farmers, who experienced what they thought of as a loss of freedom. Before the war, most small white farmers had raised food for their families and grew a little cotton. The war and successive crop failures ruined many of these farmers. To get supplies from merchants, they were forced to grow more cotton and commit part of the crop as collateral, which was property the creditor can seize if a debt's not paid, which became known as a crop lien. Because interest rates were high and the price of cotton fell steadily, many farmers found themselves in debt. Both black and white farmers found themselves caught in sharecropping and crop lien systems. But a far higher percentage of black farmers rented their land. However, every census from 1880 to 1940 counted more white than black sharecroppers. Here's a picture of the Cotton Depot in Guthrie, Texas. Bales of cotton have been loaded onto trains for shipment. After the Civil War, more and more white farmers began growing cotton to support their families, permanently altering their formerly self-sufficient way of life. Though the rural South economy suffered, southern cities saw considerable growth in the post-war period. New railroad lines allowed city merchants to engage in commerce with the North, and a new urban middle class of merchants, railroad entrepreneurs, and bankers benefited from the expansion of cotton production. Reconstruction transformed the lives of all Southerners. The antebellum world of master, slave, and independent yeoman had been replaced by a post-war world with new social classes: landowning employers, black and white sharecroppers, white cotton farmers, black wage workers, and urban businessmen. The debates over land, labor, and political power that defined Reconstruction in America had parallels in other societies that experienced emancipation. In each case, planters tried to make former slaves return to plantation work to grow the same crops on slavery and grow the same crops as under slavery, and considered black workers, freed black workers that is, as lazy and devoid of ambition. Slaves sought independence through owning land to avoid labor similar to that of slavery, or through other strategies to escape white control. Planters attempted to replace freedmen with a new foreign source of labor, and that is Indians in the British case in the Caribbean and Chinese in the American case. But the United States was unique, as a post-slavery society in that it gave freemen the right to vote, an event that emerged as a result of a struggle between Congress and President Andrew Johnson over the course of Reconstruction. This is an engraving drawing of Chinese laborers working on a Louisiana plantation during Reconstruction. Now, the making of radical Reconstruction. If we have a focus question for this section, it would be, what were the sources, goals, and competing visions of Reconstruction? First, let's take Johnson's vision. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor to the presidency, was initially responsible for Reconstruction. Johnson had risen from poverty in a political career in state politics in Tennessee, which he represented in the U.S. Congress and where he was a governor. Johnson championed Tennessee's white small farmers and made enemies of the state's large slave-owning planters. Staunchly Unionist, Johnson was the only senator from a seceding state to remain in the Senate, and he served as Tennessee's military governor during the war. His vice presidency, the Republicans hoped, would gain support for the party in the South, but Johnson lacked Lincoln's political acumen and ability to compromise. Johnson also defended states' rights. He argued that since secession was illegal, Southern states never actually left the Union or gave up their right to govern their own affairs. And Johnson, while supporting emancipation, was deeply racist and did not believe blacks had a role to play in Reconstruction. In May 1865, Johnson started to release proclamations that inaugurated a period that historians call presidential Reconstruction. This is 1865 to 1867. Johnson offered pardons, which restored political and property rights, except for slaves, to all white Southerners who took an oath of allegiance, excluding only Confederate leaders and wealthy planters whose pre-war property was worth more than $20,000. But Johnson soon pardoned those exempted by this rule. He also appointed provisional governors and ordered them to call state conventions, elected by whites only, to establish Southern state governments. These new state governments were required only to abolish slavery, repudiate secession, and refuse to pay Confederate debts. Now, whereas many people in the North had first supported Johnson's plans, Southern whites mostly returned prominent Confederates and old elites to power, and violence against freed people and Northerners in the South generated opposition to Johnson's policies. Now, responding to Johnson, new state laws in the South regulated the lives of former slaves, and these were called the Black Codes, and they caused the most opposition to Johnson's Reconstruction policy. Although these laws gave blacks the right to legally marry, own property, and access the courts in some ways, they denied them rights to testify against whites, to serve on juries or state militias, or to vote. They also allowed authorities to arrest and hire out to white landowners any blacks who refused to sign annual labor contracts, a measure to force the former slaves to return to the plantations. Some states prohibited blacks from buying land and allowed judges to assign black children to work for their former owners without parental consent. These codes, in an effort to reinstate conditions of slavery, violated the free labor principles of the Republican North and caused many in the North to believe that Johnson's policy was encouraging white Southerners to restore their pre-war way of life. In December 1865, Johnson declared that the establishment of loyal governments in all Southern states had reunited the nation. But radical Republicans in Congress, who coalesced around opposition to Johnson's policies, called for new state governments that would exclude rebels from power and guarantee the vote to blacks. These radicals believed that the Union victory presented an opportunity to guarantee equal rights for all, despite race. They welcomed the expanded powers of the federal government and thought federalism and states' rights could not prevent national efforts to secure equal rights. Charles Sumner, a Massachusetts senator, and Thaddeus Stevens, representing Pennsylvania in the House, were the most prominent radicals. Stevens, in particular, wanted to confiscate the lands of disloyal planters and distribute them to former slaves and northern migrants. But most members of Congress respected property rights too much to embrace Stevens' land reforms. Here, from Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, another popular newspaper of the time, this is January 19th, 1867, is an engraving, selling a freedman to pay his fine at Monticello. Under the black codes enacted by Southern legislatures immediately after the Civil War, blacks convicted of vagrancy, often because they refused to sign contracts to work on plantations, were fined, and if unable to pay, were auctioned off to work for the person who paid the fine. This, by the way, is Thaddeus Stevens, leader of the radical Republicans in the House of Representatives during Reconstruction. Although Republicans had an overwhelming majority in Congress, the South had no representatives, the party was divided. Radicals were only a minority. Most Republicans were moderates who thought Johnson's plan only needed improvement. The moderates believed that Southern and Northern whites would never accept black suffrage. Moderates and radicals refused to seat Southerners elected to Congress, but the moderates made sure that Southern governments remained. Moderates extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau and proposed a Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which defined all persons born in the United States as citizens and spelled out rights they enjoyed regardless of race. Equality before the law was central to the bill, making it impossible for states to have laws such as the Black Codes that discriminated against blacks. Free labor values also informed the bill, which prohibited laws denying citizens rights to make contracts, to bring lawsuits, or enjoy protection of person and property. The bill said nothing about black suffrage, however. Johnson, who shocked Congress by vetoing both bills, claimed he was defending states' rights and said that blacks did not deserve citizenship. Johnson's vetoes alienated many in the Republican Party, and in April 1866, the Civil Rights Bill became the first major law in U.S. history to be passed over a presidential veto. Congress then created its own Reconstruction plan. It soon passed and sent for ratification the 14th Amendment, which placed in the Constitution the principle of citizenship for all persons born in the United States, and it also empowered the federal government to protect the rights of all Americans. The amendment bans the states from abridging the, quote, privileges and immunities of citizens or denying them the, quote, equal protection of the law. This language allowed further Congresses and federal courts to give meaning to this promise of legal equality. As a compromise between moderate and radical Republicans, the amendment did not grant black suffrage, but it did stipulate that any state that denied voting rights to any group of men, would face a reduction in its representation in Congress. Emancipation also threatened the South's political power because now all blacks, not just 3/5, could be counted in determining a state's representation in Congress. The 14th Amendment offered the White South's political leadership a choice: allow black men to vote and keep their representation, or limit the vote to whites and lose power in Congress. The 14th Amendment created great conflict between the parties. Not one Democrat voted for it, and only 4 Republicans opposed it. Although radicals deplored that it did not give blacks the vote, the amendment made legal equality, regardless of race, a basic right of all American citizens. By the way, it's a cartoon of Andrew Johnson. This is a lithograph by Currier and Ives. Because of his stubborn opposition to the Congressional Reconstruction policy, one disgruntled citizen drew a crown on his head with the words, "I am king." Okay, so that's sort of like graffiti on top of the original cartoon. And here's a Democratic Party broadside from the election of 1866 in Pennsylvania. And it uses racist imagery to argue that government assistance aids lazy former slaves at the expense of hard-working whites. The 1866 elections revolved around the 14th Amendment. Johnson urged voters to elect men to Congress who supported his policies and claimed that radicals were plotting to assassinate him. This, along with riots in southern cities targeting blacks, undermined support for Johnson's allies, and Republican opponents emerged victorious in the election. But every southern state except Tennessee refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. Johnson and the White South's resistance pushed moderate Republicans into the radical camp. And in March 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which temporarily divided the South into 5 military districts and called for the establishment of new state governments in which black men could vote. This inaugurated the period of radical Reconstruction, lasting till 1877. Congress simultaneously approved a measure prohibiting the president from removing certain office holders, including members of the cabinet, without the Senate's consent. Johnson believed this unconstitutionally limited his authority, and when he removed the Secretary of War, Edward M. Stanton, a radical ally, the House approved articles of impeachment, sending charges against Johnson to the Senate, which was to decide his fate. It was the first time a president had faced trial in the Senate for, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors, end quote. Not all Republicans supported impeachment, and Johnson indicated that he would halt his interference with Congress's Reconstruction policy. He barely escaped impeachment. Republicans nominated Ulysses S. Grant for president to run against Horatio Seymour, the Democratic candidate and former New York governor, in the 1868 election. Reconstruction was the issue in those elections. Republicans tarred Democrats with secession and treason, a tactic called waving the bloody shirt, whereas Democrats denounced Reconstruction as unconstitutional and made racist appeals, arguing that black suffrage violated American political traditions. Now, this is Reconstruction. The title is Reconstruction. It's an elaborate allegory of national reconciliation, equality, and progress, designed by Horatio Bateman and printed in 1867. The overall message is that Reconstruction, grounded in liberty and equality, would restore goodwill between the sections and the races. The structure at the center symbolizes the federal government. It is being rebuilt as black and white men carry new pillars representing the states to support it. The old bases of some of the columns, called Foundations of Slavery, are being replaced by new ones representing liberty, justice, and education. Under the dome, former rivals shake hands, including Generals Grant and Lee, and Republican editor Horace Greeley and Jefferson Davis. Scenes surrounding it include a schoolyard, men and women voting, and Indians and whites sitting together. At the top are the heads of great figures of American history, as well as historical characters including Joan of Arc, John Milton, and Jesus Christ. The eagle at the center carries a streamer reading, "All men are born free and equal." And here's a Democratic ribbon from the election of 1868 with Horatio Seymour and Francis P. Blair, Jr., the party's candidate for president and vice president. The ribbon illustrates the explicit appeals to racism that marked the campaign. All right, now, here is a map of the presidential election of 1868. Grant won that election with 73% of the electoral vote, but only 53% of the popular vote. Now, constitutional reform. Grant won the presidential contest by a slim margin. Republicans responded in February 1869 by adopting the third and final Reconstruction Amendment, the 15th, which barred federal and state governments from denying the right to vote to any citizen based on race. Denounced by Democrats, the amendment was ratified in 1870. The 15th Amendment enabled states to make suffrage restrictions not based on race, however, but based on things like literacy tests, property requirements, poll taxes, and also the 15th Amendment did not give the right to vote to women. But it represented the culmination of the abolition of slavery. Reconstruction laws and amendments reflected the power of the new national state and the idea that citizens should enjoy legal equality. They were, in the words of one Republican, a, quote, great constitutional revolution that transformed the federal system and the language of American freedom. Their guarantees of legal equality affected discriminatory laws in all states, North and South. The new amendments also changed the relationship between the states and the federal government. The Bill of Rights had assumed that the central government threatened liberties, but the Reconstruction amendments assumed that only the national government could protect individual rights. They made the Constitution an instrument by which vulnerable minorities could make claims for freedom and against government misconduct at all levels. Many important 20th century Supreme Court decisions were based on the 14th Amendment, such as the 1954 Brown ruling outlawing school segregation. Together with far-reaching congressional legislation meant to secure former slaves' access to the courts, the ballot box, and public accommodation, and to protect them against violence, the Reconstruction Amendments transferred much of the authority to define citizens' rights from the states to the nation. They were crucial in creating the world's first biracial democracy, in which people only a few years removed from slavery exercised significant political power. They forged a new constitutional relationship between individual Americans and the national government and created a new definition of citizenship. Birthright citizenship remains an eloquent statement about the nature of American society and a repudiation of a long history of equating citizenship with whiteness. So profound were these changes that the amendments are frequently seen not simply as an alteration of an existing structure, but as a kind of second founding, which created a fundamentally new document with a new definition of both the status of blacks and the rights of all Americans. Now, here's an engraving by Thomas Nast, one of the great cartoonist engravers of the 19th century, again in Harper's Weekly, November 20th, 1869, called Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner. And it's was published shortly before the ratification of the 15th Amendment, and it graphically illustrates how the boundaries of freedom had expanded during Reconstruction. The guests include, among others, African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, men and women, all enjoying a harmonious feast. The table's centerpiece contains the slogan "Universal Suffrage." That's the right for everyone to vote. Reconstruction recast the boundaries of American freedom. Exclusions that limited citizenship and its privileges to white men had long defined American democratic practice. Even Republicans committed to universal rights did not want to extend rights to all races. Some Republicans, such as Anson Burlingame, Frederick Douglass, and Charles Sumner, wanted to end discrimination against Asians in the nation's immigration laws and treaties. When in 1870, Sumner tried to strike the word white from naturalization requirements, Western state senators made Africans eligible for naturalization but barred Asians from becoming naturalized citizens. Up until the 20th century, Asian immigrants could not become citizens, whereas their American-born children became citizens automatically. Women's rights advocates discovered the limits of Reconstruction era egalitarianism. They saw the expansion of federal power and rights as a moment to advance women's equality, but their demands, especially the demand for women's suffrage, found little support among male politicians, even among radical Republicans, who considered Reconstruction an opportunity to benefit black men. The 14th and 15th Amendments specifically benefited men, not women, and caused a division within the feminist camp between feminists and radical Republicans. For example, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony opposed the 15th Amendment because it did not enfranchise women. They tried to sever women's rights from abolitionism and even appealed to racism to demand the rights for women first. Other abolitionist feminists, such as Abby Kelly and Lucy Stone, argued that the Reconstruction Amendments, though limited, were advances toward universal suffrage and should be supported. These two sides split into two groups: the National Women's Suffrage Association, right, representing the former, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, representing the latter. Okay? National Women's Suffrage, supporting women's right to vote before African Americans got the vote, and American Women's Suffrage Association, supporting universal suffrage as soon as any group could get it. One area where women's political rights did expand during Reconstruction was in the Wyoming Territory, which extended suffrage rights to women in 1869 in hopes of attracting women emigrants. Despite drawing the boundaries of freedom at gender, Reconstruction marked the only society in the world in which emancipation had been followed by an extension of citizenship rights to former slaves. This is an engraving from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, February 4th, 1871. It's a delegation of advocates of women's suffrage. The group includes Elizabeth Cady Stanton, seated just to the right of the speaker, and Susan B. Anthony at the table on the extreme right. Now, radical Reconstruction in the South. If we have a focus question here, it would be what were the social and political effects of radical Reconstruction in the South? Very important, especially the social effects. The Reconstruction Act sparked great political activity among former slaves in the South, who held mass meetings, went on strike, and tried to desegregate public transportation. Thousands of Southern blacks joined the Union League, which was an organization tied to the Republican Party, and the vast majority of eligible black voters registered to vote. In the words of one former slave turned political leader, blacks had heard the tocsin of freedom. A tocsin is the sounding of a bell, a major bell. So, for instance, the Liberty Bell, when it was ringing, that was called the tocsin. By 1870, all former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union, and most were under Republican control. Their new state constitutions, drafted in 1868 and 1869 in conventions with substantial black representation, were a major improvement over the old state constitutions. They created state-funded systems of free public education, created penitentiaries, and orphan and insane asylums where none had existed before. They guaranteed equality of civil and political rights and abolished antebellum practices such as whipping as criminal punishment, property qualifications for office holding, and imprisonment for debt. Although blacks were the majority of Republican voters, white Republicans controlled the state Republican parties and held most political offices. Only South Carolina, with a high percentage of blacks in the population, had a majority black legislature. But the 2,000 African Americans who held public office in Reconstruction represented a radical shift of power in the South. 2 blacks were elected to the U.S. Senate. 14 were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and 1 served as the first black governor in Louisiana. Many blacks served in state legislatures, and more blacks than ever before held lower offices such as sheriff, tax assessor, and policeman. Most of these, by the way, were former slaves. Here's another Harper's Weekly engraving, Electioneering at the South. July 25th, 1868, depicts a speaker at a political meeting in the rural South. And you see women as well as men took part in these grassroots gatherings. And here's a lithograph from 1883, looking back on the period during Reconstruction, celebrating African American progress during Reconstruction. It's called From the Plantation to the Senate. Among the black leaders pictured at the top are Reconstruction Congressman Benjamin S. Turner, Josiah T. Walls, and Joseph Rainey, Hiram Revels of Mississippi, the first African American senator, religious leader Richard Allen, and abolitionist Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown. At the center, emancipated slaves work in the cotton fields, and below, children attend school, and a black family stands outside its home. You have to zoom in to see that. And here, this is a very, very famous engraving, very, very famous depiction of the first vote, supposedly. Again, Harper's Weekly, November 16th, 1867, depicts the first biracial elections in Southern history. Right? The voters represent key sources of black political leadership that emerged during Reconstruction. There's the artisan carrying his tools, the well-dressed city person, probably free before the war, and the soldier. Okay, now these are not depictions of specific people, right? It's just depictions of the basic change that had happened using sort of stock images of these different types of black political leaders. The South's new state governments also empowered new groups of whites. Some were Northerners who migrated to the South after the war. Opponents called them carpetbaggers, implying that they packed their possessions in a suitcase to quickly move to the South and gain the spoils of office. Although a few were corrupt, most carpetbaggers were actually Union Army veterans who decided to stay in the South after the war. Others were investors in land and railroads seeking economic opportunity. Yet others were teachers, Freedmen's Bureau officers, or others who traveled to the South to help former slaves. Most white Republicans, however, were from the South and were despised by former Confederates who saw them as treasonous scalawags. Although a few were wealthy whites, most were white non-slave-holding small farmers from the southern upcountry. Many had been Unionists during the war or hoped Reconstruction governments would pass laws favoring indebted farmers. The Reconstruction government's greatest accomplishment was establishing state-supported public schools that served both black and white children, although usually in segregated schools. They also passed civil rights laws that made it illegal for railroads, hotels, or other institutions to discriminate by race. Some states also strengthened the economic power of rural blacks by passing laws favoring agricultural workers and sharecroppers. Reconstruction governments did not try to promote economic prosperity through land distribution, as many blacks had once hoped, but rather tried by developing railroads, which they hoped would spur industrialization, urbanization, diversified agriculture. Every southern state tried to finance railroad construction and attract industry through tax and subsidy policies, but a revitalized southern economy failed to take shape. Nevertheless, radical Reconstruction transformed the South by empowering poor whites, northern migrants, and former slaves. It's a measure of how far change had progressed that the reaction against Reconstruction proved so extreme. This is a picture of black and white members of the Mississippi State Senate, 1874 to 1875, shortly before the end of Reconstruction in the state. The woman in the row below, by the way, was a postmistress, below on the right. And here's a portrait of Hiram Revels, the first black U.S. senator. The portrait is by Theodore Kaufman, a German-born artist who immigrated to the United States in 1855. Frederick Douglass, commenting on the dignified image, noted that African Americans, quote, so often see ourselves described and painted as monkeys that we think it a great piece of fortune to find an exception to this general rule. Here's an 1865 lithograph entitled Emancipation, and it's unusual because along with the familiar images of Lincoln and emancipated slaves, it also portrays a poor white family, suggesting that all Americans would benefit from the end of slavery and from Reconstruction. This is a group of black students and their teacher, and a picture taken by an amateur photographer who's probably Union Army veteran while touring Civil War battlefields, which happened quite a lot, actually, after the war. There's sort of a 2 or 3 year gap, and then people that sort of, although on a very small scale, the battlefield tourist industry became a new phenomenon. Now, the overthrow of Reconstruction. If we were to have a focus question for this part of the lecture, it would be what were the main factors both in the North and in the South for the overthrow of Reconstruction? The South's traditional leadership, planners, merchants, and Democratic politicians condemned the new governments as corrupt and inefficient examples of black supremacy. But corruption, which existed in Reconstruction governments, was confined to no single race, region, or party. The rapid growth of state budgets allowed many to enrich themselves at public expense, but corruption was greatest elsewhere, especially in the whiskey ring, which was something involving Grant administration officials, and New York's famous Tweed ring, controlled by Democrats and led by Boss Tweed. Rising taxes needed for schools and railroad development also sparked opposition to Reconstruction, including among poor whites who had initially supported the Republicans but bolted to the Democrats when their economic situation did not improve. Southern whites opposed Reconstruction primarily because they could not accept that blacks should vote, hold political office, or enjoy legal equality. They thought Reconstruction should be overthrown in order for white supremacy to return and planters to have a disciplined and dependable workforce. Violence was endemic in the Reconstruction-era South. At first, it was local and unorganized, with blacks being assaulted and murdered for refusing to make way for whites on sidewalks or trying to purchase land. But the establishment of Republican state governments after 1867 ignited organized campaigns of violence against supporters of radical Reconstruction. Secret societies, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, tried to prevent blacks from voting and tried to destroy the Republican Party by assassinating local leaders and public officials. The KKK, a terrorist organization started in 1866 in Tennessee, soon spread to throughout the South, and it functioned as the military arm of the Democratic Party in that region. In many counties, it started a reign of terror against black and white Republican leaders. But blacks were especially targeted, particularly blacks who either held office or exercised political rights. The new Southern government could not suppress the KKK, and in 1870 and 1871, Congress adopted 3 enforcement acts that outlawed terrorist groups, and it also allowed the president to use the army against them and defined acts that deprive civilians of civil and political rights as federal crimes. President Grant dispatched federal marshals and troops to suppress the KKK, and by 1872, most areas of the South were peaceful. The KKK has a huge revival later in the century, but we'll talk about that later in the class. Here's a cartoon from around 1870, political cartoon. It illustrates a key theme of the racist opposition to Reconstruction, the idea that blacks had forced themselves upon whites and gained domination over them. A black school teacher inflicts punishment on a white student in an integrated classroom, and a racially mixed jury judges a white defendant. And here is a perspective scene in the city of Oaks, a cartoon in the September 1st, 1868 issue of the Independent Monitor, a Democratic newspaper published in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The cartoon sent a warning to Reverend A.S. Lakin, who had moved from Ohio to become president of the University of Alabama. Also sent to Dr. N.B. Cloud, a Southern-born Republican serving as Alabama's superintendent of public education. The Ku Klux Klan forced both men from their positions. Now, again, although most of the Klan's victims were black, the 2 men pictured here are white. Now, they weren't hanged, but this was sort of a threat. This is one of the most famous cartoons, one of the most famous images coming out of this period. Notice the Ohio written on the carpet bag, right, carried by the Reverend, the figure is supposed to be the Reverend Lakin on the right. And here's a Tennessee member of the Ku Klux Klan who was photographed in his hooded disguise around 1870. Northern commitment to Reconstruction declined in the 1870s. Radicals, such as Thaddeus Stevens, died or otherwise left politics, and they were replaced by figures less dedicated to equal rights for blacks. Northerners more and more felt that the South should solve its own problems without continuous federal involvement. Many in the North felt, and many in the North believed, that now that the national government had freed the slaves, made them citizens, and given them the vote, blacks had to depend on themselves. In 1872, an influential group of Republicans, angered by corruption in the Grant administration and believing that federal power needed to be reduced, formed their own party, calling themselves the Liberal Republicans. They nominated Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, for president. They repeated Democratic criticisms of radical Reconstruction as encouraging corruption and preventing the rule of the best men. Democratic leaders embraced the Republican split and endorsed Greeley, but many rank-and-file Democrats couldn't stomach Greeley, a former Whig and Republican, and Grant won a second term to the presidency by a great margin. Nonetheless, liberal Republicans and Democrats in the North could now agree on rolling back Reconstruction. Northern critics stepped up their often openly racist attack on Southern governments as dens of corruption and misgovernment ruined by the black vote. A severe depression beginning in 1873, a worldwide depression, also distracted Northern Republicans from Southern issues. Democrats were wildly successful in the 1874 elections and took control of the House of Representatives. But before this new Congress met, legislators passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This barred racial discrimination in public accommodations such as hotels and theaters. The Supreme Court also signaled a retreat from Reconstruction in the slaughterhouse cases, which 1873, in which it held that the federal government could not effectively protect the legal and civil rights of individuals in the states, which effectively mitigated the 14th Amendment. 3 years later, the court gutted the Enforcement Acts by throwing out the convictions of some of those responsible for something called the Colfax Massacre of 1873. This is the Old Plantation Home, a lithograph from 1872 produced by the prominent firm of Currier and Ives in New York City. It illustrates how a nostalgic image of slavery as a time of carefree happiness for African Americans was being promoted even as Reconstruction took place. Now here you see also changes in depictions of blacks. Graphic artist Thomas Nast's depiction of blacks in Harper's Weekly mirrored the evolution of Republican sentiment in the North. And Not This Man, right, August 5th, 1865, shows the black soldier as an upstanding citizen deserving the vote. Colored rule in the reconstructed state, March 14th, 1874, suggests that Reconstruction legislatures had become travesties of democratic government. Here is a bank book issued by the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, a private corporation established by Congress to promote thrift among former slaves. Black individuals, families, church groups, civic organizations deposited nearly $2 million in branches scattered across the South. The bank failed in 1874 because of mismanagement, and thousands of depositors lost their savings. Now, here's that map we started off in the beginning at the very first part of the lecture. Reconstruction in the South, 1867 to 1877, which shows all the former Confederate states when they were readmitted to the Union and when the Reconstruction governments failed and were replaced by what were known then as conservative governments. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction was under serious assault. Democrats regained control of states with large white voting majorities such as Tennessee, North Carolina, and Texas, and called themselves redeemers for having redeemed the white South from corruption, misgovernment, and Northern and black control. Violence flared in states where Reconstruction governments persisted, and the Grant administration now refrained from protecting besieged governments and Republicans. In 1875 and 1876, armed Democrats on Election Day simply destroyed ballots and drove blacks away from the polls, capturing states such as Mississippi and South Carolina. Events in South Carolina directly shaped the outcome of the 1876 presidential elections. Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, who ran against the Democrat Samuel J. Tilden, who was New York's governor. By 1876, only South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana were still controlled by Republicans, and the election was so close that whoever carried those states, which both parties claimed to have won, would become president. Congress tried to resolve the impasse by appointing an electoral commission, which, with a Republican majority, decided that Hayes had carried the critical southern states and had been elected. But to secure this result, behind the scenes, Republicans negotiated with Democrats, agreeing to recognize Democratic control of the South and refrain from future federal interference in Southern affairs. Democrats promised to respect black rights and not to dispute Hayes's right to office. This became known as the Bargain of 1877. Hayes quickly ordered federal troops to stand down, which allowed Democrats in Louisiana and South Carolina to occupy state governments. Significantly, the triumphant Southern Democrats failed to live up to their pledge to recognize blacks as equal citizens. And here is a good map of the presidential election of 1876. Now, the thing is, it looks like Tilden has won more because of all the green, but the population and the popular vote is skewed. Okay, so you can see that it's very close. As I said, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina were disputed, right, and then assigned to Hayes by the Electoral Commission. So it really was the presidential election and then the Compromise of 1877 among the most disheartening things about American history in this period. It was a definite sort of backroom deal that was just, everyone was so sick of the whole thing, they just decided, they jumped at any chance just to have what they saw as the problems of Reconstruction go away. And here again is Thomas Nast. You can think I have owned stock in Thomas Nast cartoons, but they're by far the most popular, far most prominent political cartoons of this period. It's a cartoon called "Is This a Republican Form of Government?" from Harper's Weekly, September 2nd, 1876. And it illustrates Nast's conviction that the overthrow of Reconstruction meant the United States was not prepared to live up to its democratic ideals or protect the rights of black citizens threatened by violence. All right. How does it end? Reconstruction, defined as America's adjustment to the end of slavery, continued long after 1877. Blacks still voted and in some states held office well into the 1890s, but a distinct period in which Republicans controlled much of the South, blacks had some political power, and the federal government protected the basic rights of all American citizens, came to an end in 1877. Only a century later, in the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, within living memory of people who are alive today, would the federal government finally act to secure the rights of all, regardless of race. Reconstruction revealed some of the tensions inherent in 19th century discussions of freedom.